All right, let's kick off another deep dive. Today, we're looking at some really cool stuff around geospatial data, specifically AI, and how it's being used to actually map buildings. You guys sent in some fascinating stuff on the Google Research Africa team and, their work filling in these huge data gaps, especially in developing parts of the world.
Yeah, their work with the Open Buildings dataset is pretty remarkable.
Remarkable might even be an understatement. We're talking 1.8 billion building footprints
Mhm.
across Africa, South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. I mean, wow. How do you even begin to wrap your head around the scale of this?
It's a massive, massive undertaking, there's no doubt. But the real question is, why should we care? What makes this data so valuable?
Well, honestly, the first thing that jumps to my mind is Google Maps. I use it all the time, but
Mm.
I never really thought about where all that building data comes from.
Right, and that's where the Open Buildings dataset comes in. Millions of buildings that weren't on Google Maps before have been added because of this project.
So when I'm zooming around, planning my next vacation, I'm seeing buildings that wouldn't even be there without this data. That's pretty cool.
It is, and it really shows how important this type of data is, for all sorts of other things too. Like, think about the UN, governments trying to deliver aid, plan services in places where information is really hard to come by.
Right. Accurate building data would be so important in those situations.
Mm,
Knowing where people are, how many there are, how spread out they are.
absolutely. Vaccination campaigns, disaster relief, even just understanding, population growth, it all relies on having a clear picture of where buildings are.
So here's where it gets really interesting to me. What if we could not only see where the buildings are, but how they've changed over time?
It's a fascinating idea, like a time lapse of the whole planet. The tricky part is keeping it updated because the world's always changing, right? New
Mm,
buildings are going up, old ones get torn down. How do you keep track of it all?
exactly. And I imagine keeping up with all that change, especially in parts of the world that aren't, photographed all the time in high resolution, must be, well, a nightmare logistically.
You're spot on. Relying on commercial satellite imagery, which has the best resolution, just isn't realistic for most of the planet. It's expensive, and the coverage is often driven by demand, by profit. So you end up with these gaps, huge gaps, especially in the developing world.
So how did the Google research team get around this?
Well, they got creative. They turned to open source imagery. From the European Space Agency's Sentinel-2 satellite, it's readily available, it's constantly updated, but there's a catch. The resolution isn't that great.
So they have these kind of blurry satellite photos, and they need to figure out where the buildings are. Sounds like a job for AI.
Exactly. They built an AI model designed to overcome the limitations of those lower resolution images.
Okay, so they've got these blurry photos, and they need to both sharpen them up and then identify the buildings. How does AI even do that?
Think of it like a master and an apprentice. They have this master AI, right, that's amazing at spotting buildings in those really sharp images. And then they have a student AI that's learning from the master by watching the master work on those Sentinel-2 pictures. So the master's knowledge helps the student make sense of all those blurry details.
That's so clever. And they're doing this for billions of buildings.
Yeah.
But what kind of information are we getting from this data?
Well, that's where it gets even cooler. They've created this thing called the Open Buildings 2.5D temporal dataset.
2.5D. That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
It might sound futuristic, but it really just means, we're not just getting those flat footprints of the building anymore. This dataset has building heights too, adds a whole new dimension.
Wait, hold on. We're seeing where they are, how tall they are, and all of this over multiple years. So we can actually see, like, skylines changing.
Exactly. And the accuracy is pretty amazing. The average error in building height is, well, less than 5 feet. It's basically like having a 3D model of a city, and it's changing over time.
That's mind-blowing. So what kind of stories can we see in this data?
Well, let's take a look at the 2018 Sulawesi earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia. This data actually shows the impact really vividly. You see the built-up area receding from the coastline after the disaster.
Wow. You can actually see the destruction unfold in the data. That's powerful.
On a brighter note, let's switch gears to New Cairo in Egypt. Brand new city built from scratch. And with this temporal data set, we can actually track how fast it's growing, this urban expansion.
So we're literally witnessing the birth of a city, seeing neighborhoods like appear out of the desert over time. That's remarkable.
It really highlights the power of this data. to visualize like real world events, And if anyone wants to explore more, the source material mentions this interactive Earth Engine app where you can really dive into these examples.
I am definitely checking that out. It's amazing to see, how it's being used. But I'm curious about the practical side of it. I mean, this isn't just about making cool visualizations, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely not. This data has huge potential to improve people's lives. Let me introduce you to Sunbird AI, a nonprofit in Uganda. They're using this data in a really, really impactful way.
Okay. I'm all ears. Tell me more.
So Sunbird AI is working to tackle the lack of electricity in Uganda. Initially, they used the open buildings data to identify areas where, setting up microgrids and solar panels would make the most sense.
Right. If you know where the buildings are, you can figure out where the demand for electricity is going to be.
Precisely. But with the temporal dataset, they can take it a step further. By looking at how building density and height have changed, they can actually help city councils, understand what areas are growing fastest and then adjust those resource plans accordingly.
So instead of just reacting to what is, they can proactively plan for growth, make sure the infrastructure can keep up.
Exactly. It's a great example of how this temporal data leads to better decisions about resources, about urban development.
This is groundbreaking stuff. It's not just about maps and data. It's about using this information to make a real difference for people.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The Google Research Africa team is constantly refining these AI models, expanding the data set. And that's what we're going to dive into after a quick break. So we're talking about, the potential of this data and how it can really make a difference.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see how something that started with mapping buildings, can have these ripple effects.
And those ripples go way beyond, what we even talked about, like disaster preparedness, for example.
Okay, so we know where the buildings are, but how does that help with, preparing for an earthquake or something?
This data set allows us to look at more than just location. So imagine, a city is getting ready for a possible earthquake. By analyzing the data, authorities could, pinpoint areas that have older buildings, structures that might not be as strong.
So they could, reinforce those buildings first or focus evacuation plans where they're needed most?
Exactly. It's about being proactive, right, instead of reactive. And that could potentially save lives.
That's a really powerful use case. And it sounds like, the possibilities don't stop there.
You got it. This data isn't just about buildings or, disasters. It can even be used to study the environmental impacts of how cities grow.
Oh, that's interesting. I can see how looking at changes in, vegetation cover alongside building growth could give researchers a lot of information about how cities affect ecosystems.
Absolutely. We could track deforestation, keep an eye on things like urban heat islands, and just get a better overall understanding of the environment's health.
It's like having this bird's eye view of the balance between, human development and the natural world.
And that bird's eye view is always changing. The Google research team, they're constantly working on those AI models, making them better, expanding the data set.
So what's next for open buildings? What are they focused on right now?
Well, one thing is improving the accuracy of how they estimate building heights. They're also looking at, adding even more layers of data.
The kind of data layers are we talking about?
Imagine having information about building materials or what kind of roofs they have.
That would be amazing. So we wouldn't just see the shape and height, but we'd know what they're made of. What could we learn from that?
The possibilities are huge. We could analyze energy efficiency, how vulnerable different types of buildings are to damage. We could even study the use of sustainable materials in construction.
Wow. It's crazy to think that something as simple as, data about roof types could lead to so many different things.
It really all comes back to the idea that data is more than just numbers, right? It's a way to connect all these different pieces and really understand things in a new way.
And speaking of connections, I'm curious about the time aspect of it all. We've been talking about how this data set captures change over time, but how far back can we actually go?
So far, the data set covers from 2016 to 2023.
Okay.
But the team is working on expanding it to go back even further.
So we could potentially look back and see how cities have changed over decades, maybe even centuries.
That's the goal, to have a historical atlas where we can actually witness how cities have grown and transformed throughout history.
That would be an incredible tool for researchers, historians, urban planners, anyone who wants to understand how people have built and lived in cities.
Yeah. It's a window into the past that can help us, understand our present and plan for the future.
This is all really exciting, but it also makes me wonder, who has access to this data? Is it hidden away somewhere, or can anyone get their hands on it?
That's a great question, and it's actually one of the most unique things about this project. The Open Buildings dataset is, well, it's open source.
So anyone can access it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's free for anyone to use. Researchers, governments, nonprofits, even regular people can benefit from this information.
That's fantastic. It really makes this data accessible to everyone, and that empowers people to make more informed decisions about their communities and the world around them.
You got it. It breaks down those barriers, allows for more collaboration, and that means people from all over can help us understand, the built environment and its impact.
Wow. You've really painted a compelling picture of how powerful this technology is and its potential.
Hmm.
I'm excited and honestly a little overwhelmed by just the sheer scale of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in for sure, but that's the whole point of a deep dive, right? We're exploring these complicated, multifaceted topics, challenging what we think we know and expanding our understanding of the world.
I completely agree. And on that note, I think we've covered a ton of ground today. We've gone from mapping buildings to tracking how cities grow to, understanding the environmental effects.
Yeah.
And it's clear that this is only the beginning.
Yeah. The Google Research Africa team is always pushing the limits of what's possible with this technology, and I'm sure they're going to keep blowing our minds.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last thought-provoking question. We've talked about how governments and organizations are using this data, but what about like regular people? How could, someone listening to this use this information to understand their community better or even like global patterns of how people are settling?
That's a really great question.
Right.
And it gets to the heart of, why this open source approach is so important. You could, in theory, go online, download the data, and start looking at the building patterns in your own neighborhood.
So I could see like how my neighborhood's changed over time. Maybe even, spot areas where there's been a lot of new construction.
Exactly. You could even compare your neighborhood to others and see how they've developed differently. And you don't need to be some kind of data whiz to do it either. There are tools and platforms out there that make it pretty easy for anyone to work with this data.
That's incredible. It really puts the power of this information in everyone's hands.
And even if you're not, digging into the data yourself, think about the broader impact. Journalists could use this to tell better stories about their cities. Educators could bring these concepts to life in classrooms. You could even have artists and designers using this data to create, visualizations or even whole cityscapes inspired by the patterns they see.
It's like this data set is a whole new way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
But with all this talk about the future, let's come back to the present for a sec. What's like one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with today?
If there's one thing I hope they remember, it's that data isn't just about numbers. It's a tool, for understanding our world, for facing challenges and creating positive change. And the Open Buildings dataset is a perfect example of that.
It's not just about maps. It's about people. It's about using information to make better decisions, to improve lives, and create a more sustainable future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as this technology keeps developing, I'm really excited to see how people, communities all around the world, will use this data to shape the world around them.
It's been fantastic exploring the Open Buildings dataset with you today. We've covered so much ground, from mapping those buildings to tracking urban growth, to understanding how cities affect the environment. And it's obvious that this is really just the beginning.
Yeah, the Google Research Africa team is always pushing the boundaries, and